They ruled the silver screen, adored by millions, chased by cameras, worshipped like gods. But behind the glamour, behind the flashing lights and red carpets, some of Hollywood's brightest stars were hiding a darker truth. Explosive tempers. Broken marriages. Secrets that destroyed careers overnight. What if the icon you grew up idolizing was actually one of the most feared, most hated names in the industry? Today, we're pulling back the curtain on 11 legendary stars whose off-screen reality shocked the world. Stay till the end. Story number 7 will change how you see Hollywood forever. Actor number 1: Marilyn Monroe. She was the most photographed woman on the planet, a smile that could stop traffic, a name that became synonymous with glamour itself. But behind the platinum curls and the breathless voice lay a woman fighting battles the cameras never captured. Marilyn's struggle with anxiety and depression wasn't a secret in Hollywood, it was an open wound. Directors grew frustrated as she arrived late, sometimes not at all, her absences quietly costing studios thousands while colleagues whispered that she'd become impossible to rely on. What the industry saw as unprofessionalism was, in truth, a woman drowning in expectations no one bothered to understand. She was boxed into the image of the dumb blonde, desired, photographed, adored, but rarely taken seriously. And when she tried to break free, forming her own production company in a male-dominated industry that had never seen an actress demand that kind of control, Hollywood didn't celebrate her ambition. It punished it. Executives who once profited from her image now saw her as difficult, ungrateful, even dangerous to the system they controlled. The tragedy is this: the world fell in love with a persona, while the real woman underneath quietly begged to be seen. Marilyn Monroe wasn't hated because she lacked talent, she was resented because she refused to stay small. And her story was only the beginning. Actor number 2: Elizabeth Taylor. With violet eyes that mesmerized a generation and a talent that earned her 2 Academy Awards, Elizabeth Taylor was Hollywood royalty. But her personal life became a spectacle so relentless, it often eclipsed the very artistry that made her legendary. 8 marriages to 7 different men, a number the press never let her forget. Each wedding, each divorce, became front-page fodder, painting her as a woman incapable of lasting happiness. But no chapter of her love life captivated, and condemned, the public quite like her affair with Richard Burton. Both were married to other people when their connection began, and the scandal that followed was seismic, splashed across magazines worldwide as the ultimate betrayal of Hollywood glamour. They married, divorced, remarried, and divorced again, a cycle the media devoured, framing their passion as proof of instability rather than simply 2 people caught in an impossible love. Beyond her romances, Taylor's taste for extravagance became its own controversy. Her jewelry collection, her lavish estates, her larger-than-life presence at every event, to some, this was elegance. To others it was excess, a symbol of a star who seemed disconnected from ordinary life. Yet strip away the tabloid headlines, and what remains is a woman who lived unapologetically on her own terms in an era that demanded women shrink themselves. Her critics called her reckless. History remembers her as fearless. Her story proves one thing: sometimes the most talked about woman in the room is simply the one refusing to be quiet. Actor number 3: Marlon Brando. He redefined what acting could be: raw, unfiltered, dangerously real. Marlon Brando didn't just play characters, he became them. But that same intensity that made him a legend on screen made him one of the most difficult men to work alongside off it. On the set of Apocalypse Now, Brando arrived overweight, unprepared, and reportedly unwilling to memorize his own lines, forcing the crew to feed him dialogue as cameras rolled. Production stalled. Costs soared. A director already pushed to his breaking point found himself managing not just a film, but a storm named Brando. Colleagues who once admired his genius began to see something else entirely: a man who demanded the world bend around him. Yet his defiance wasn't limited to film sets. When he won the Oscar for The Godfather, Brando refused to accept it, sending an indigenous rights activist in his place to protest Hollywood's treatment of Native Americans on screen. It was one of the most audacious moments in Academy Awards history. To some, an act of extraordinary courage. To others, an insult to an industry that had just honored him. His personal life told a similarly complicated story. Numerous relationships, several children, and years later, painful accounts from those children describing distance, neglect, and a father they struggled to truly know. The man celebrated as one of cinema's greatest talents left behind a legacy tangled with brilliance and heartbreak in equal measure. Marlon Brando was never easy to love, but he was impossible to ignore. And that, perhaps, was always the point. Actor number 4, Frank Sinatra. That voice could fill a room, silence an audience, make an entire generation fall in love. Frank Sinatra was more than a singer, he was an empire. But behind the tailored suits and the effortless charm was a temper that colleagues learned to fear, and a reputation that followed him long after the music faded. Sinatra's anger was legendary. Friends, staff, even fans found themselves on the receiving end of sudden explosions of rage, often over the smallest of slights. His clashes with the press became the stuff of tabloid infamy, with photographers and journalists learning the hard way that catching him off guard could come at a cost, sometimes even a physical one. It painted a portrait of a man who demanded control, and punished anyone who dared to take it from him. Then came the whispers that never quite disappeared, persistent rumors linking Sinatra to organized crime. He was often seen in the company of notorious figures from the underworld, fueling speculation that his rise wasn't built on talent alone, but on connections most stars would never dare associate with. He never confirmed it. He never fully denied it either. And in Hollywood, that silence spoke volumes. His personal life carried its own storm. For marriages, countless rumored affairs, and a reputation for infidelity that made headlines almost as often as his music did. To his fans, he was untouchable, a voice for the ages. To those who worked closest to him, he was something far more complicated, brilliant, magnetic, and at times, nearly impossible to survive. Frank Sinatra didn't just chase the spotlight, he ruled it, on his terms alone, and woe to anyone who forgot that. Actor number 5, John Wayne. He was the face of the American West, tall, unshakable, the embodiment of grit and heroism on screen. For decades, John Wayne wasn't just an actor, he was a symbol. But strip away the cowboy hat and the larger-than-life persona, and you find a man whose off-screen views made him one of the most polarizing figures Hollywood has ever produced. Wayne was fiercely political, and he never hid it. His outspoken support for the Vietnam War placed him directly at odds with a generation of Americans who saw the conflict as senseless and devastating. While counterculture movements swept across the country, Wayne stood firm, doubling down on his stance even as it painted him as a relic clinging to an old order the world was rapidly leaving behind. To his supporters, this was conviction. To his critics, it was a dangerous refusal to evolve. But it was his comments on race that did lasting damage to his legacy. Over the years, Wayne made remarks about African Americans and Native Americans that many considered deeply offensive, statements that revealed a worldview increasingly out of step with a changing society. He even expressed admiration for controversial historical military figures known for their brutal treatment of indigenous communities. For an industry slowly beginning to reckon with representation and inclusion, Wayne became something of a cautionary symbol, a reminder of how quickly a beloved icon could become a source of division. His on-screen persona only deepened the controversy. Wayne built his career playing men who were stoic, dominant, and unwavering, the ultimate portrait of rugged masculinity. Audiences adored it. But to others, that same persona read as rigid, insensitive, and increasingly disconnected from a world beginning to value vulnerability and nuance over brute strength and control. Even his professional relationships bore the mark of his uncompromising nature. His collaboration with acclaimed director Howard Hawks, though it produced celebrated films, became strained over time as creative disagreements piled up. Wayne wasn't a man who yielded easily, on set or off it, and colleagues often found themselves working around his demands rather than alongside his vision. By the time his career reached its later years, John Wayne had become something rare in Hollywood, a legend whose talent was never in question, but whose legacy remained forever tangled in controversy. Beloved by millions for the heroes he brought to life, criticized by just as many for the man behind them. His story is a reminder that the biggest stars don't just entertain us. Sometimes, they force us to confront exactly who we choose to admire, and why. Actor number 6, Judy Garland. She gave the world one of its most beloved films, her voice carrying generations over the rainbow and into dreams. But behind Judy Garland's radiant smile was a childhood stolen, and a life spent fighting battles the studio system itself had created. From the time she was a teenager, MGM controlled nearly every aspect of her existence, including her body. To keep up with brutal filming schedules, she was reportedly given stimulants to power through the day and sedatives to force her to sleep at night, a cycle imposed on her before she was even old enough to understand its consequences. What began as studio-mandated management spiraled into a lifelong dependency that would follow her for the rest of her career. As the years passed, her unreliability on set became the subject of industry gossip. She arrived late. She sometimes couldn't perform at all. Directors who once marveled at her talent grew frustrated by the delays, the mood swings, the unpredictability that seemed to shadow every production she touched. Few stopped to ask why the woman who lit up the screen as a child could no longer hold herself together as an adult. Her personal life mirrored the case. 5 marriages, each one straining under the weight of her struggles, including her union with acclaimed director Vincente Minnelli, a partnership that produced remarkable films but couldn't survive the pressures building underneath. Judy Garland wasn't simply a star who fell apart. She was a child raised inside a machine that demanded perfection and offered no protection in return. Her story isn't one of weakness. It's a warning about what fame can cost when nobody is looking out for the person behind it. Actor number 7, Joan Crawford. She clawed her way from nothing to becoming one of the most powerful names in Hollywood, and she made sure everyone around her knew exactly how hard she'd fought for it. Joan Crawford's discipline was legendary. Her demand for perfection was even more so. But that same relentless drive that built her career also built a reputation that made her one of the most feared women in the industry. On set, Crawford tolerated nothing less than total commitment. Directors, co-stars, and crew often found her exacting standards suffocating, describing an atmosphere where every detail, every take, every moment had to meet her impossibly high bar. Off-set, it wasn't any different. Her home was kept with the same obsessive precision as her film sets, every object in its place, every standard non-negotiable. But nothing defined Crawford's public image quite like her decades-long rivalry with fellow legend Bette Davis. 2 of the most formidable actresses of their generation, both fiercely proud, both unwilling to back down, their tension simmered for years before finally erupting on the set of a film that forced them to share the screen. What audiences saw as thrilling on-screen chemistry was, behind the cameras, something closer to open warfare, 2 titans locked in a rivalry neither was willing to lose. To some, Crawford was a trailblazer, a woman who refused to let the industry dictate her worth. To others, she was cold, controlling, impossible to please. Perhaps both were true at once. Joan Crawford didn't ask to be liked. She demanded to be respected. And in an industry built on charm, that made her one of its most unforgettable and most feared forces. Actor number 8, Natalie Wood. She lit up the screen as a child star and grew into one of Hollywood's most captivating leading women. But Natalie Wood's story doesn't end with applause and awards. It ends with a mystery that has haunted the industry for decades. On a quiet November night in 1981, Wood was aboard a yacht off the coast of California with her husband, actor Robert Wagner, and fellow actor Christopher Walken. By morning, she was gone, found in the cold waters near the boat. The official explanation pointed to a tragic accident. But almost immediately, the story began to unravel under the weight of unanswered questions. Reports of tension aboard the yacht that night, conflicting accounts from those present, and a strained relationship between Wood and her husband all fed a growing sense that the full truth had never been told. As the years passed, public suspicion only deepened, eventually leading investigators to formally reopen the case decades later and name her husband a person of interest, though no charges were ever filed. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened on that boat. What we do know is that a woman celebrated for her talent and grace left the world under circumstances shrouded in doubt, her legacy forever intertwined with a question Hollywood has never been able to answer. Natalie Wood's story isn't about scandal or temper. It's about how even the brightest stars can vanish into darkness, leaving behind nothing but silence, and a mystery that refuses to fade. Actor number 9, Howard Hughes. He was an aviator, a filmmaker, a billionaire before the word even carried the weight it does today. Howard Hughes seemed to have everything money and ambition could buy. But behind his empire was a mind at war with itself, and a descent into isolation that turned one of the most powerful men in America into one of its most tragic recluses. Hughes lived with an overwhelming fear of germs and contamination, a condition that gradually consumed his daily life. He reportedly went to extreme lengths to avoid contact with anything he deemed unclean, a compulsion that only intensified as the years passed. What began as unusual habits slowly transformed into complete withdrawal from the world around him. His need for control didn't stay confined to his personal life. On his film productions, Hughes became infamous for endless interference, re-editing footage obsessively, demanding costly reshoots, and delaying releases for years while directors and actors were left waiting in limbo. His business ventures followed a similar pattern of erratic, unpredictable decisions that left partners and employees struggling to keep up with a man increasingly guided by impulse rather than reason. As his condition worsened, Hughes disappeared almost entirely from public life, spending his final years in near total isolation, cared for by a small circle of aides while the outside world could only speculate about the state of the man behind the legend. Howard Hughes built one of the most remarkable empires in American history. But his story is also a haunting reminder that even limitless wealth and power can't outrun the battles happening inside someone's own mind. Actor number 10, Roman Polanski. Few directors have shaped modern cinema quite like Roman Polanski, a filmmaker whose work earned him critical acclaim across the world. But his career has remained permanently overshadowed by a legal case from 1977 that continues to define public perception of him to this day. Polanski pleaded guilty to a serious criminal charge involving misconduct with a minor, a case that drew intense media scrutiny given his prominence in the industry. Before sentencing could take place, he left the United States for Europe, where he has remained ever since, avoiding extradition for decades. That decision, to leave rather than face the American justice system directly, has remained one of the most debated aspects of his story, seen by many as an evasion of accountability that no level of artistic talent can excuse. Polanski's personal history adds further complexity. As a child, he survived the horrors of World War II, losing family members to unimaginable tragedy, experiences that undeniably shaped both the man and the haunting, deeply human quality of his films. Some have pointed to this history as context for understanding him. Others argue that no past trauma can serve as justification for the harm caused to a victim decades later. To this day, opinions on Polanski remain sharply divided. Some continue to celebrate his contributions to film. Others believe his continued presence in the industry represents a troubling failure of accountability. His story remains one of Hollywood's most uncomfortable reckonings, a place where genius and grave wrongdoing exist in the same undeniable frame. Actor number 11, Robert Blake. He built a career playing tough, no-nonsense characters, earning an Emmy for one of television's most iconic detective roles. But Robert Blake's legacy would ultimately be defined not by his performances, but by a scandal that gripped the entire country. In 2001, Blake's wife, Bonnie Lee Backley, was fatally shot while sitting in his car outside a restaurant in California. Blake claimed he had briefly stepped away to retrieve something he'd left behind, returning to find her gone. The circumstances surrounding that night immediately raised suspicion, and Blake soon found himself at the center of one of the most closely watched criminal trials in Hollywood history. The case became a media sensation, with the public fiercely divided over his guilt. In 2005, Blake was acquitted in criminal court, but was later found liable for his wife's death in a separate civil trial, a verdict that left his reputation permanently damaged regardless of the criminal outcome. Throughout the proceedings, his cold, detached demeanor did little to win public sympathy, only deepening the sense that something didn't add up. Even before the scandal, colleagues had described him as difficult and volatile, a temper that had quietly shaped his reputation long before it became national news. What followed simply confirmed, in the public's eyes, a darker side that had always been there beneath the surface. Robert Blake's story is a stark reminder that in Hollywood, a single night can undo a lifetime of work, and that the cameras rarely capture the full truth of who someone really is.